In today's episode, I will start by reading Chapter 9 of the Trust Premium book, where I would ask the question, do your customers trust you? Don't answer it yet. Listen to what research said. Then I will start diving into the first half of Chapter 10, where I discuss the relative trust model, and I will discuss the first three components that constitute the who you are components of competence, personality compatibility, and symmetry. The components of the relative trust model are how a customer decides whether they trust you or not. Let's get started right after this. Welcome to The Trust Show. I'm Yoram Solomon, your host, the author of the Book of Trust, and facilitator of the Trust Habits Workshop. My mission is simple. I want to help you form habits that build your trustworthiness, because the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you? Chapter 9. Do your customers trust you? Do your customers trust you? Do your current customers trust you enough that they will not switch to another provider if the price was right? When you approach a new prospective customer, do you think you inspire them to trust you? Let me guess. You answered yes to all the above, right? Well, I have news for you. In June 2022, consulting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, PwC, surveyed 503 business leaders, 2,002 employees, and 2,508 customers. They asked the business leaders, how much do you think your customers trust your company? The result was that 87% of them believe that customers highly trust their company. Then they asked the customers, how much do you trust companies in the following industries? The response was a mere 30%. There is a 57% gap between how much business leaders believe that customers trust them and how much customers really trust them. They further asked about specific industries. How much do you trust companies in the following industries compared to a year ago? In all of the 9 sectors they asked about, the most significant percentage, varying from 52% to 72%, was of customers who said they trust companies the same. However, in all 9 of them, more respondents stated that they trust those entities less than those who said they trust them more. In one case, the ratio was greater than 3-1. HubSpot surveyed 928 respondents in 2016, updated in 2017, and published the results under the title, Only 3% of people think salespeople possess this crucial character trait, referring to trust. They asked the question, who do you consider to be trustworthy? Doctors topped the top of the list with 49% of respondents, followed by firefighters with 48%, then teachers with 38%, and nurses 36%. Then the numbers dropped dramatically. Accountants and lawyers were at 12%, customer service professionals at 4%, investment bankers, marketeers, and salespeople at 3%, stockbrokers at 2%, and car salesmen, it wasn't clear if they referred to new or used car salesmen, at 1%, next to politician. Nothing to brag about. So, let me ask you again. Do you think your customers trust you? And if you answered this question before with yes, let me recite Tommy Lee Jones playing Deputy Marshal Samuel Gerard in the movie The Fugitive. Do you want to change your bullshit story, sir? In general, customers don't trust salespeople. Don't worry, it's not your fault. In chapters 1 and 2, I told you whose fault it is. It actually could be your fault if you practice any of the trust-destroying practices I described in those chapters. I hope you don't. But there is an opportunity here. If customers naturally don't trust salespeople or professionals in general, you have an opportunity to differentiate yourself by, well, being trustworthy. Chapter 10. The Relative Trust Model. The Book of Trust explains the relative trust model in great detail and, in general terms, applicable to every relationship. Here, I will provide a high-level description, but focus on the context of the trusting relationship between a customer and a salesperson or professional offering value in return for money. The model is described in the following diagram. It comprises 6 components, one of which is divided into 2 subcomponents. There is another grouping here to the components of who you are, competence, personality, compatibility, and symmetry, and what you do, positivity, time, and intimacy, where positivity is further divided into the subcomponents of no BS and empathy. The who you are components are your brand. They describe what you typically do. They are not based on a single interaction, but rather on the cumulative effect of your actions over time. They establish the starting trust level when an interaction starts. When you begin interacting with a customer, they attribute a certain level of trust to you based on knowing who you are. They rely on evidence, for example, the 4 R's of transferable trust, instead of their emotional, subjective interpretation during the interaction. The evidence could simply be the cumulative effect of previous interactions with you. The who you are components are slow to change and change between interactions rather than during interactions. They could be transferable, the 5th law of trust, and can be established through a third party rather than a first-hand impression. In other words, they may form your opinion of your trustworthiness, or lack thereof, based on what they learn from someone they trust and who knows you well without ever meeting you. The what you do components, on the other hand, describe what you do right now during the current interaction with a customer. They establish the ending trust level when the interaction ends. They rely on first-hand impressions by the customer and are much more subjective as they interpret your behavior during the interaction. The customer's first-hand impression takes precedence over what they thought they knew about you at the beginning and before the interaction. If, for example, they were told that you never lie, yet they caught you lying during the interaction with them, their assessment of your trustworthiness would be that you are a liar. The what you do components are very quick to change. The customer forms their opinion on your trustworthiness during the interaction, even if that interaction is very short. They cannot be transferable since they rely on first-hand impressions while you and the customer are present. Customers may challenge their first-hand impression based on what they thought they knew about you from a third party, but their first-hand impression will always take precedence. In the following, I will describe the different components and focus on how they apply to a salesperson's or a professional's trustworthiness evaluation from the customer's perspective. However, remember that even here, different contexts and industries could influence how customers view these different components. The description here will be relatively brief. In Part 3, I will provide specific behaviors that could make you more trusted and refer to the different components at play for each behavior. Note that some of those behaviors spill over into more than one component. Competence. Competence is an important part of who you are in the customer's eyes, but I will make a distinction between whether you are a professional offering and delivering a service or a product yourself, or you are a salesperson offering a product or service delivered by others. Let's say that you are a consultant. The customer cares about your competence as a consultant. Do you know enough about their business? Are you up to date on techniques and tools that can help them? Do you have enough experience in that field? However, competence is also important when you are merely a salesperson selling someone else's products or services. They care about how well you know their product and can answer questions about it. They care about how well you know the competition and how the product compares to it, for better or worse. They care about your confidence, although they may not trust you if you show overconfidence. Competence is the technical, professional, and somewhat objective component of the who you are group. In my survey of 213 participants, with one exception item that only had 89 participants, I asked how different components typically associated with competence would affect the customer's decision to choose provider A, who demonstrated that characteristic, over provider B, who doesn't demonstrate that characteristic. You can see that overall, demonstrating those characteristics will significantly increase the probability of being chosen by a customer, with the participants stating that they are between more likely to much more likely to hire you if you demonstrated that characteristics. With only two, experience and confidence, ranking just slightly below more likely, but still significantly above a little more likely to hire you. One thing to note, though, is that even this partial list of characteristics that could cause a customer to consider you more competent and thus be more likely to trust you and hire you to do a job is contextual and can change between different industries and contexts. Personality compatibility. One thing distinguishing my relative trust model is that it's based on the premise that personality compatibility is not necessarily absolute. It should be considered from the customer's perspective, and that perspective matters. The personality compatibility component of trust focuses on the extent to which the customer and the salesperson have compatible personalities. Note that the compatibility of personalities does not mean that those personalities are identical. Being compatible could mean that they are different and even opposite, but that they work well together. My general premise is that the more compatible your personalities are, the more the customer considers you trustworthy. When considering personality compatibility, 5 factors categorize the elements of the different personalities and the compatibility between them. The personality indicators, the scope of personality differences, the alignment between the customers and the provider's personalities, the importance of compatibility of a specific element, and your, the provider, ability to control them, which I call controllability. Let's break them down further. Personality indicators. There are several indicators of your personality and the customer's personality: values, perspective, intentions, motivations, behavior, and other personality components. Some of those indicators can be measured through personality type tests such as Myers-Briggs, DISC, Enneagram, etc. But for many of those, there are no tests yet. You and the customer may have different values, perspectives, intentions, motivations, typically affected by values, and behaviors resulting from those. My surveys found that the most significant component affecting trust is shared values, with an 86% correlation. Scope: the good, the bad, and the different. It's easy to categorize relationships as either good or bad, But things are rarely so black and white when it comes to the dynamic between a customer and a provider. The scope of compatibility in these relationships spans a range from universally good or bad elements to simply different ones, shaped by personal, cultural, and organizational preferences. At one end of the spectrum are universal elements, values, motivations, and behaviors that are objectively judged as good or bad anywhere in the world. Those factors are critical for trust between customers and providers. For instance, honesty is a universal standard. Can you imagine a customer trusting a provider who knowingly lies about a product or service? Likely not. Universally, telling the truth builds trust, while lying destroys it. At the other end of the spectrum are personal preferences, which are neither universally good nor bad, but simply different. Customers evaluate these subjective factors through their own unique lens when deciding whether to trust a provider. For example, a customer might prefer a risk-taking provider who pushes boundaries with bold, innovative solutions. Another customer might favor a more risk-averse provider who prioritizes stability and caution. Neither approach is inherently good or bad, but trust can erode if the customer and provider are misaligned in their attitudes towards risk. Imagine a customer who values bold, fast decisions working with a highly cautious provider who takes time to evaluate every option carefully. The customer may perceive the provider as slow or overly conservative. Conversely, a cautious customer might view a bold provider as reckless or unreliable. While these differences are not inherently bad, they can still create a trust gap. Interestingly, trust is often asymmetrical in these scenarios. A bold customer might appreciate the steadying influence of a cautious provider, trusting them to mitigate risk. However, the cautious customer might struggle to trust a bold provider, fearing recklessness. Understanding this dynamic is key to building trust. Between the universal and personal lies the cultural layer. What is acceptable or even expected in one culture might be completely inappropriate in another. This applies to national cultures as well as corporate ones. For example, in one corporate culture, it might be common for providers to take clients to dinner to build relationships. In another, the same action might be perceived as unnecessary or overly formal. Without understanding cultural expectations, a provider may unknowingly violate trust even with the best intentions. Another layer of complexity exists within the organizational culture of both the customer and provider. Each company has its own processes, traditions, and norms. These can affect how trustworthiness is interpreted. For example, if a customer's organization values rapid response times, a provider who delays follow-ups, even slightly, might be perceived as unreliable. On the flip side, a provider working with a highly bureaucratic organization might struggle to build trust if approvals take too long. Adapting to these organizational nuances is critical to fostering trust. Many factors influencing trust between a customer and provider, such as values, preferences, and experiences, are deeply ingrained. However, bridging these differences often begins with one simple yet powerful action: ask. By asking questions and seeking to understand the customer's preferences, expectations, and concerns, a provider can tailor their approach to align more closely with the customer's needs. Similarly, customers can build trust by communicating their priorities clearly and openly. Alignment. What works better? A provider who focuses on details or one who sees the big picture? The answer depends on the customer's needs. Trust issues arise when there is a mismatch. Just like conflicting financial attitudes can strain marriages, misaligned customer-provider relationships often lead to frustration and mistrust. Interestingly, alignment doesn't always mean being the same. A risk-taking customer might trust a cautious provider to keep them grounded, while a cautious customer may distrust a bold provider, viewing them as reckless. Some customers value similarity, preferring a provider who gets them, while others trust providers with complementary traits that bring balance and new ideas. Ultimately, alignment comes in three forms: similar, matching the customer's personality and preferences; complementary, balancing and enhancing the customer's traits; different, providing a fresh perspective, though this can cause friction. To build trust, providers must understand which type of alignment the customer values most. Asking and adapting is key. Importance. In the provider-customer relationship, the importance of personality compatibility stems from how shared or unshared values or traits impact the customer's trust in the provider. It's not simply about the number of shared values or compatible traits, but their relative significance. For example, a provider might share several values with a customer, such as responsiveness, professionalism, and reliability. However, if the provider consistently fails to deliver a critical value for the customer, like transparency or honesty, this single incompatibility can outweigh all the shared values. A customer might tolerate missed deadline or lower than expected product quality, but trust could be irreparably damaged if they perceive dishonesty. When considering personality compatibility with a customer, it's essential for the provider to evaluate the weight customers assign to specific values. For instance, a highly analytical customer might place enormous value on data-driven decision-making and find emotional appeals untrustworthy, no matter how personable or likable the provider is. Conversely, a customer who prioritizes relational warmth might overlook minor logistical mishaps as long as they feel genuinely cared for by the provider. In summary, a customer's overall trust in a provider is not determined by the sheer number of compatible traits, but rather by the weight customer gives those traits relative to the incompatibilities. Controllability. If a particular incompatibility is critical to the customer and reflects a fundamental value or expectation, it comes down to the provider's ability to control this difference. If the provider cannot control that incompatibility, the incompatibility acts as a deal breaker, and trust cannot flourish unless one party adapts significantly. Not all incompatibilities are deal breakers. When the incompatible trait is important to the customer but less so to the provider can adjust their behavior to align with the customer's expectation. This hinges on two key questions. 1. Is the provider willing to adapt? A provider must evaluate whether aligning with the customer's preferences is worthwhile. For example, a customer may prefer frequent status updates on a project. If the provider is typically less communicative, they might decide whether the potential trust in business justifies the effort of sending regular updates the customer prefers. 2. Is the provider capable of adapting? Even if the provider is willing to adjust, they must assess whether they can reliably implement the change. For instance, a provider who naturally dislikes small talk might struggle to create a warm rapport with the customer who values personal connection. The key question is whether they can implement systems or habits to bridge the gap effectively. In Part 4, I will show processes to form new habits that change old behaviors, but I will state up front that not all behaviors can be modified. Willingness and capability are interconnected. A provider might become more willing to adjust if they realize the adjustment is within their capacity. Conversely, the provider might invest in building their capability, for example, training or habit formation, if they recognize the trust-building potential. When dealing with customers, providers should 1. Identify key compatibility and incompatibility factors. Use early interactions to understand which traits or behaviors matter the most to the customer. 2. Evaluate the weight of incompatibilities. Determine whether any specific incompatibility is a deal breaker based on its importance to the customer. 3. Assess willingness and capability to adapt. Decide if the effort required to address the incompatibility is feasible and worthwhile. And 4. Communicate clearly. If adapting to an incompatibility is not possible, explain the constraints transparently to the customer, which may mitigate negative perceptions and maintain some level of trust. By prioritizing and addressing critical incompatibilities, providers can build stronger, more trust-centered relationships with customers, even when natural alignment are not perfect. In my 2018 Innovation Culture and Trust Survey, I found an astounding 86.3% correlation between shared values and trust, with a very strong statistical significance of a P factor of less than 0.001. Simply put, for every 1 point increase on a 7-point scale in the customer's belief that you share values with them, the level of trust they have in you will increase by 0.863 points. In my 2023 and 2024 studies, I found that customers are between more likely and much more likely to hire a service provider if they are friendly, have shared values, are like the customers, personalize things for the customers, and have high integrity. High integrity ranked the highest, while being like me ranked the lowest, although still much higher than a little more likely to hire them. Symmetry and fairness. The relationship between a salesperson or a professional and the client is asymmetrical, and there is nothing you can do about it. Symmetry is a situational component, and the situation is given. You are selling or providing a product or a service, and the customer pays money for it. There is almost nothing symmetrical about this, other than the fact that you are exchanging something of similar value. And that's actually an important point. The similarity of value is an important element of symmetry. The similarity of risk is too. Finally, customers like to be treated fairly. Fair pricing would be an element of the symmetry component. In my survey, I included 4 components that would generally align with the fairness and symmetry of the provider-customer relationship. One is that the provider shows a desire to achieve a win-win outcome from the transaction. Another is that the provider treats the customer fairly compared to other customers. One more is that the provider relies on reviews, which might indicate that they would care more for the value exchange to be symmetrical, and that the provider makes the customer feel important. Of those 4, relying on reviews ranked the lowest, with customers indicating that they are between a little more likely and more likely to hire a provider who cares about the reviews they are getting from customers, while the other 3 ranked between more likely to much more likely. Again, it is important to note that those are only sample components of fairness and symmetry, and that other components might apply to your specific industry and context. And that wraps up today's episode of The Trust Show. We explored the reality of customer trust, the trust gap that exists in business, and the first three components of the relative trust model: competence, personality compatibility, and symmetry. Hopefully, this gives you a new perspective on how customers evaluate trust and what you can do to strengthen it. But we're not done yet. In the next episode, I'll be reading the second half of Chapter 10, where I will dive into the remaining components of the model. This time, I will focus on the what you do during an interaction with your customer. I'll break down positivity, time, and intimacy, and I'll share insights on how these factors shape the trust that your customers feel in the moment. I'll see you again next week. I hope this gave you a new perspective about trust and trust premium. May trust be with you. This was The Trust Show. What would you like to know about trust and trustworthiness? Let me know and I'll answer it in a future episode. I would love to hear from you. Email me at yoram@thetrustshow.com. If you like this episode, subscribe to the show so you will automatically get notified when I release a new episode. Rate it. Write a review for this podcast because those ratings help not only you, but also others looking for podcasts just like this. If you're looking for more resources to learn about how to build trust, be trusted, or know who to trust, look up my workshops, online courses, books, or go to my website, trusthabits.com. And remember that the answer to these two questions will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you? And can you trust me? Thank you for listening or watching The Trust Show.